These Cold Walls of Thunder Bay, Chapter 2. Like a tidal wave it appeared out of the water, dark, foreboding, and atmospheric. The searchlight shone brilliantly around the island that Thunder Bay Prison stood upon, making sure that no one escaped. The barbed wire electric fences glimmered in the moonlight, standing tall as a reminder to all of us who dared to try and escape that there would be no chance. The boat that we were on, that Stanley, Carter and me rocked and swayed with the current of the sea. And in those first moments of seeing what was to be home for us over the next God knows how long, it made me feel sick. Stanley had barely said a word since he was arrested, and knew that he'd be locked away for a long time to come. The only words he would ever utter be ones of innocence. He would even cry out in his sleep, "It wasn't me, let me go. Let me go back to Alice." It must have been every night he cried that out. I blamed Carter. If he had never opened that stupid pub, then none of this would have ever happened. Sure, we would have still been stuck in the streets, but we wouldn't be about to step foot into Thunder Bay Prison. What did I know about it before I arrived? Little. I knew that it would be hell. I knew that it was so bad that even the rats would try and escape. I also knew that they executed. Firing squad, I believe it was. The boat docked at a small yard below the main entrance. The guards in the boat ushered us off with the end of their guns. We were pushed out into the darkness of the island. The rain was just starting to pour down, and all I could hear in the distance was the sounds of waves crashing up against the island. "Welcome home, scum!" shouted one of the guards. A few of the others in the boat rose to it and shouted back. We didn't know what to think, so we stayed quiet. The guards calmed everyone down and began to lead us into the yard. This is it, I remember thinking. There's no turning back now. Upon entry to the prison, the first thing we did was get our prison number. Stanley was 4316, I was 4317, and Carter was 4318. Next, we had to deposit what belongings we had brought with us into the prison. If you ever got out, you might see them again. That was always going to be a big if. We could all take in one item from the outside, a family photo maybe, or a postcard, something like that. I didn't bother. Carter tried to take in a small switch knife, but that certainly wasn't allowed. Stanley took the poppy that Alice had given him. Our first night was spent in a holding cell. We arrived so late that this was the only option. The three of us were there, ushered into the small dark cell that was only lit by a single candlelight. The small flickering flames soon burnt out, much like our hopes of ever seeing home again. The heavy iron doors slammed shut behind us. That was it. We were home. "I can't do this," Stanley shouted and began grabbing at the cell door. He seemed to hope that the guards had left it open and he could just walk out. I took hold of him, the first time I've ever probably shown any emotion towards him in our lives. "It'll be okay, we'll get through this. We just have to stay calm and wait for the lawyers to show that we're innocent." Stanley wiped away his tears. "Don't let anyone in here see you do that," quipped Carter. "They'll have you killed before you can wipe your nose." I turned and glared at him. It was obvious that Stanley wasn't coping. He just needed a bit of sympathy, a shoulder to cry on. Stanley pulled away from my grip and walked to the back wall of the cell. He slid down the wall and held his head in his hands. Carter hoisted himself up into the top bunk, and I settled into the bottom one. This was going to be one hell of a first night. Hell, it was going to be one hell of a life sentence if they didn't let us out. "What is it going to be like in here?" Stanley asked after what seemed like an eternity of silence. "They'll keep us locked up until it's time to go to work. Then they will work us until it's time to be locked up," replied Carter. "That'll be it, until they release us or they kill us." He had no compassion. "Work?" I asked. I didn't know at the time. "Work!" Carter shouted back. "They will have us doing some damn manual labour that no other bastard'll do." He was right. The work wouldn't begin for a few days after our arrival, but when it did, it never seemed to stop. "Who did it?" I asked. I couldn't hold it in much longer. "Who killed Jeff and Frank?" The guys just remained silent. "It wasn't me. I didn't kill them," I said. "Why would I do it?" Carter just snorted. "Well, I certainly didn't kill them. I haven't got it in me," he said. From the shadows cast by the small flickering flame I could see Stanley shaking his head. I knew he couldn't have done it. It was also heated and happened too fast. It was impossible to tell. "All I hope," Stanley began, "is that the person who did kill them is caught and I can get home and out of this place." Those were the last words that were said that night. As I blew out the candle, I could hear the distant storm drive nearer and the thunder rumbled. Only now do I realise the symbolism of that storm and how fast it was crashing towards us as we were stuck in that cold, dark cell in Thunder Bay. "Fresh fish!" The voice of the guard echoed down the long corridors of the cells as we were marched down the halls towards our cell, along with our new prisoners. It was scary. The other prisoners were like dogs, shouting, screaming, clanking against the bars of their cells, spitting and throwing things towards us. "All right, settle down," shouted the guard. He led us down the halls, pushing the guys in front of us into cells and slamming the doors shut. I was next. He got hold of my arm and chucked me in. We were lucky. Stanley was in the cell across the hallway. At least we could see each other and talk to each other if we wanted to. Not that Stanley was much fun to talk to anymore. I saw Carter being shoved into a cell just down from us, but he wasn't in talking distance. After a little while, the other prisoners settled down and the prison seemed to fall silent except for a few whispers between cells. "George! George!" I heard Stanley call over to me. I looked up and caught his eye. "What?" I whispered back. "How are you holding up?" he called back. I just shook my head. I hated my cell. What was there to like about it? A small hammock, a barred window, a desk with a candle and a chamber pot. Horrible, I whispered back. It was only early in the morning, but I felt like I'd been awake for hours. Surely this wasn't what it was going to be like day in and day out. I was just about to call back over to Stanley when a guard walked by and smacked the cell bars with the end of his gun. I knew then that they were always listening and always watching. I retreated back from the door and stood on the bed and looked out over the barred window. The sea had calmed down from the storm the night before. The searchlights were being guarded, just in case they were needed. That was the thing about Thunder Bay. The cells were left as they were when it was built over 100 years before, but everywhere else had electricity. The hallways had lights, there were searchlights and electric fences outside, and most of the cell doors had electric locks. But our cells were just basic. It was no way of life for us. I must have nodded off for a while, because the next thing I knew I woke up with a start as the cell door flew open and a voice called out, "Roll call!" In a haze of tiredness I jumped up and fled out the door. I must have been one of the first ones out. All the other inmates, those who had done this 1,000 times before, all made their way out. I saw Stanley standing across from me and I finally caught sight of Carter at the other end of the hall. "Okay, scum," the guard shouted. "New prisoners report to the governor for work. The rest of you, lunch. Move it, come on!" Everyone filed off in their different directions. We regrouped and followed the guard to where he was taking us. Stanley and Carter stood to the back of the group and I was pushed and shoved somewhere in the middle. That's when I first met Art. "What are you in here for?" he asked. "Murder not proven," I said quickly, adding that last bit. He looked back at me doubtfully. "Robbery for me," he said. "I'm Arthur, but you can call me Art." I nodded at him. "This is where we find out what work they're going to get us to do," he said. "I hope we get to work outside here." "They let us work outside?" I asked. "Yes, of course. It's usually down to fools like us to go out there and build the railways or dig the mines." I hoped to get out and do that. I doubt they would let Carter do anything, he was too old and would tire too easily. We were marched up flights of stairs and down long dark corridors. It felt like we were walking for hours, but we finally entered a small and very well kept smart area of the prison building. This was the governor's area. You could tell. "Okay, scum, wait here till the governor calls you in," the guard shouted. One at a time all of the men went in. "Stanley, come over here." Stanley made his way up the line towards me. "Maybe if we stand close together, we'll get the same jobs," I said. The line began to shorten and soon enough it became my turn. In I went. There was no turning back. "I'm Governor Dolan," the short but yet stern man behind the desk said. "I expect you to only speak to me when you're spoken to. If not, there will be punishment. Do you understand?" The child inside me ignored him, hoping to ignore him and have the long drawn-out fight about when the right time to speak should be, but I replied, "Yes, sir." Good, Dolan replied. He put on his glasses and looked back down at his notes. He looked up and down the list. Ah, yes, Elsner, George, he said. He looked up from his notes with his glasses perched on the end of his nose. He looked directly into my soul. That's how it felt, anyway. I have a good job for you. Tomorrow and every day, for the next 3 months, you will catch the boat from Thunder Bay Island and make your way, along with the others, to Sandbach Point. There you will partake in the building of the railroads. I'll take that, I thought. Any excuse to leave this place behind for a few hours. It would do me just fine. Now, started Dolan, I believe that your brother is also incarcerated with us. Is that correct? I nodded in reply. Well, I don't want you two working together. It will only end in disaster, especially with what you both did to land yourselves up in here. For now, run along. I'll be around to see you later today. Nasty little bastard, I thought under my breath as I was leaving. God only knew what Dolan had planned for Stanley, but well, as long as it kept him busy. A few moments later, Stanley came out of Dolan's office looking as sick as a dog. What have they got you doing? I asked. It took him a moment to come to himself before he could tell me. Carter, who had indeed been sent out to the railroads with me, along with Art, gathered around to hear his fate. He began, but he had to stop and take in a deep breath. They've got me building the chair. We stood in silence for a few seconds. I suppose while one of us got up the courage to ask. The chair? Carter said. There was another silence. Art jumped in. The chair, old Sparky. It's a new device of execution, quite big down in Texas just now. You're found guilty, they strap you in, switch it on, 10,000 volts, and you're toast. I tried to catch Stanley's eye, but he was focused on the floor. And you have to build it? Carter asked. All Stanley could do was nod. I could tell he was once again fighting back the tears. He was the most harmless person you could ever meet, but here my brother was the chosen one to help build a device that would kill thousands, guilty or not. I didn't want to show any emotion because I feared it would set Stanley off. Maybe it would set me off too, I don't know. But what I did know was that our time at Thunder Bay was about to get difficult. You could set your watch to those damned electric doors slamming open first thing of a morning. At exactly 7 the buzzer would ring and the gates to hell would open. Today was our first day on the job. As ever, we had what they called breakfast, a ladle of porridge, a cup of coffee, and then we were sent on our way. Just as the guards called us away, I took hold of Stanley. Stay strong, brother, I said to him. I will, he replied. For Alice. Without a second glance, he turned and walked away towards the team that would be building that lethal device. As for Carter, Art and myself, we were off down to the boating dock. We were chained together in one big line. They obviously didn't trust us to travel or work without trying to escape. We made the short distance back onto the mainland, where we were marched along the line by the guards. We walked for what seemed like a good half an hour. God help any man who decided to stop for a few seconds to catch his breath or wipe his brow. This is what Carter found himself doing quite often. Just behind him walked a nasty little guard. He was known as Yorkie. Ah yes, Officer York, as he liked to be called, but none of us would ever bother calling him that. He thought he ran the entire prison, when in actual fact all he did was shout and belt orders. Even within our first few days at Thunder Bay, we knew he was the punchline of many jokes made. On this first trip out to the railroads, Yorkie walked hot on Carter's heels. If he even thought about stopping, our good pal Yorkie was there to smash him in the ribs, or kick him, something nice like that. We arrived on what felt like the hottest day of the year at the railroads, Skull Creek, it was known as. Loads of other guys and some children as well were already hard at work, transporting the lines, carrying, lifting, and so on, attempting to make the tracks. There wasn't much instructions given, but rather just Yorkie pointing to follow what the others were doing. He loaded his gun and sat back and watched us work. The bastard had even brought his lunch with him. As I worked away on that first day, I couldn't help but think of what Stanley was doing. First he'd be getting a crash course in joinery work, and then a short lecture on electricity, then it was down to work. No matter how bad it got here, out at Skull Creek, I would have hated to swap places with him. We worked the day away without so much as a few seconds to catch our breath. It must have just gone 4 when I heard Art bellow at me from a distance. George, come here! I looked around to make sure there were no guards looking and legged it over to where he was. "What is it?" I asked. He didn't say a word but simply nodded towards a table. The table sat out for the guards. It was full of beer, food and snacks. "Do you think we can get at it?" I asked. "I wouldn't think so," said Art. "But I think it's worth a shot," he added. Without waiting, Art ran over to the table. He didn't even look around. He picked up a bottle of beer and began to drink. He stuffed his pockets and his face with as much food as he could. I looked around, waiting for Yorkie or one of the other ones to catch on to what was happening, but it seemed so quiet. Art turned and ran back towards me. I think he was wanting me to come and help myself, but it was too late. A gunshot rang out. No, it didn't hit him, but he started to run, probably quicker than he had ever moved in his life. Right behind him was Yorkie. I too ran back, hoping that it wouldn't be a case of guilt by association. Yorkie was too fast, for Art anyway, and caught up with him. I couldn't begin to tell you how bad his beating was, but for the guys watching at the far end of the railroad, they could hear him screaming. He was sent back to Thunder Bay and to the hospital wing. As for the rest of us, it was back to work. Heavy lifting, dragging, manual labour and a lot of sweating and swearing went on. We seemed to work for hours in the heat. It was made worse by the guards sitting in the distance, laughing and joking with each other while they drank their beer and ate their feast. It wasn't fair. The sun began to drop after what felt like weeks of working away. The guards, including Yorkie, whose knuckles were starting to bruise after attacking Art, gathered us all up and did the check to make sure we were all still there, which we were, minus Art, of course. The chains were put on and we were marched back to the boat. God, it was such a difficult long walk after all that work. And that was just day one. I couldn't even think of how many more days I would have to keep up doing this. It was late evening by the time we got back to the bay. The boat ride was particularly rough, made worse that we were told that we were too late for supper. We got marched back to our cells, which slammed shut with that delightful clang, and the lights were instantly switched off. I looked over to Stanley's cell. I whispered over to him, but he was already asleep, or so I thought anyway. It was only a few moments later I heard him crying from the darkness of his cell. It must have been rough, I found myself thinking. It only felt like I'd been asleep for a few hours when the lights were switched on and the cell doors opened again. "Breakfast, move it!" a voice shouted from out in the corridor. I pulled myself out of bed and walked out of the cell. Stanley was just emerging as well. "How was it?" I asked. "Horrible," he replied. I never thought that making something as simple as a chair would upset me so much. I just tried to think, it's only a chair. But I know it's a device to kill. I knew he was innocent already, but if I had any doubt, it would be gone. Stanley didn't kill anyone that night. If only the guards could see that. I filled Stanley in about the railway work. "You're better off here," I informed him. "It's horrible out there." And that was only day one. Over breakfast we continued our conversation, but we were interrupted by the presence of another prisoner, Benny. It was such a sad thing. Benny was going to be the first prisoner executed on that chair for his part in a murder. Stanley put his spoon down and held his head down as he overheard this. He knew the first execution would be soon. "Oh, I just can't do this," he said. "I really can't." It was difficult, sure enough, but secretly I was glad Stanley had that job. I would rather that than him going out onto the railroads and working himself to death. After breakfast it was time to head back to work. Back out there, I suppose. It was better than being stuck in hell. It wouldn't be long, though, until we really experienced just what Thunder Bay Prison could be like. It wouldn't take long before all hell would break loose.